Good morning. It is On the Farm Wednesday, and we've got Jean from the Education Department back again today. Yay! Hi, Jean.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us for this Plugged into History program. This is On the Farm Wednesday, and today we're talking about children's work. So when we talk about the work of children on a plantation, we aren't just talking about the work of enslaved children. We'll be talking a little bit about the Middleton family as well. And so we just really appreciate you being here. Thanks for joining us. This is a really important topic. We hope that you are able to share this with your friends and family and your kids as well, and maybe draw some parallels between their responsibilities today and the responsibilities of children in all different social structures in the 18th and 19th centuries. So without further ado, now we've got some folks watching. I stalled long enough for you, Jean, that now we got some eyeballs on you. So this is On the Farm Wednesday. Thanks everybody for joining us, and take it away, Jean.
Well, hi. As Karen mentioned, we're going to concentrate a little bit on work. Yesterday, Greg and I were here and we demonstrated some games and playful things that children would have been doing on the plantation. But of course, just like today, it's not all play and no work. Even children had responsibilities on the plantation. We had a couple of different groups of children, and here in the Stableyards area, we do talk about work a lot. So we thought it would be appropriate to set up here in the Stableyards, but you most likely wouldn't have seen the Middleton's children here. They were concentrating most of their responsibilities on formal education. Formal education came in a couple different forms. Just like today, we start very young learning the 3 R's: reading, writing, math, science, languages. The Middletons certainly would have been responsible for that higher level of education that was expected of them in their social standing. Middletons.
And is that expected of both boys and girls, Jean, to receive
Definitely.
the education of all those different things?
Definitely.
Cool.
There's certain aspects of their education that would have been a little bit different, but they definitely were raised to a level that they could have had very intelligent conversations in the society that they would have kept. So for example, Middletons hired a French tutor, Freneau, in 1781. He came to Middleton Place and tutored the children of the Middleton family. A governess would have been in charge of making sure that the Middleton's children were employed most of their day in the pursuit of knowledge. So they didn't have all the leisurely pursuits that we might have on our days off on the weekends, but they certainly had enough to play like we did yesterday. So along with the formal education of reading, writing, and arithmetic, they also would have concentrated on the formal arts, the fine arts of music and drawing and painting. In fact, if you wanted to see an instrument that the Middletons would have practiced on, we have a flute in our music room in the Formal House Museum made of boxwood and ivory that the Middleton children would have practiced on.
So when you all come back and visit us, you have to take a house tour and you can see that.
For sure. So young ladies were also instructed in some fine fiber arts, something like embroidering on this fine pocket. You could see it would have required a lot of patience, a lot of exact stitching, and it would have showcased the skill of a young lady in this particular endeavor. Lace was the same type of thing. So they would have taken a lot of time to prepare, almost like, I guess, a repertoire or a portfolio of some of the things and the skills that they learned how to do. For young ladies, they might have learned how to use the spinning wheel. Now, they weren't creating yarn or thread for sewing, but it was a skill, and if anyone has ever seen this at work or tried it themselves, you know that it is a little bit like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. So that definitely, if a woman could have used the spinning wheel, it would have not only highlighted her skill as a seamstress or a fiber arts student, but probably a little physicality as well. Some of the other aspects of a formal education would have been in the social graces. So we have not only these embroideries,
domestic
sides of things where ladies would have maybe convened, but there were some other more formal aspects of socializing that a young lady would have certainly been instructed on, like formal teas. We can almost identify with how difficult it is to set a formal table, even just getting the knife and the fork in the right place. But young ladies would have had to know how to set a table for tea in an exact way and known when to serve things at certain times. So that would have been pretty difficult to learn, and it definitely would have been tested at these formal tea ceremonies. Another aspect of social gatherings that young men would have had to be pretty well versed in is shooting and hunting. So they would have been pretty skilled at the fine arts of loading weapons and shooting weapons. They also had to learn how to ride to take part in some of the formal fox hunts that actually took place right here. Jumping fences, and certainly riding with skill that would have been equal to an adult would have been seemed as pretty valuable for the Middleton's children. They also had to be presented in more formal aspects than even those social gatherings that might have taken place here on the plantation. Governor Henry's children, he was the ambassador to Russia. He would have presented his children at the court in Russia. So they had to know what to say and how to say it, and they were definitely instructed in that capacity. Not only here on the plantation by tutors and governors, but the Middletons would have sent their children overseas, especially the young men, to stay in families' homes or at boarding schools in Europe. Not only expanding their knowledge of the language and geography, but also to fine-tune some of those skills.
I mean, we know Arthur himself, right? He was sent to boarding school and then law school in London. So the great patriot Arthur Middleton is taking his coursework from the finest in the world in London.
Generations of Middletons would have been expected to kind of live up to this expectation. So it is work in a sense, but maybe not the type of work that we're used to talking about. When we think about work, we think about manual labor. And one group of children on the plantation, the slave children, wouldn't have been afforded this type of formal education in the reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, some would have learned how to read and write. Some learned how to count, even in our games that we talked about yesterday. But it wasn't instructed. In fact, most of the time, slaves were denied the opportunity to read and write, and they, according to the laws, it was illegal for them to do so. So I wanted to have Karen take a closer look at this suit of clothing. This is an adult suit of clothing. Children on the plantation were fast growing. Their feet outgrew shoes, just like ours do today. And children were not afforded the same allotment of food or clothing ration than an adult slave would. That had a little bit to do with the value of the work that they presented to the plantation, a kind of a return on their investment. They were growing really quickly, so the slaves' children might have had shirts that came up halfway up your arm, or maybe exposed your ankles, and they were given one set of clothes as opposed to probably two a year. So that was almost used as an incentive. For young people, we can identify with the appetites of 12 and 13-year-old children. I have 3 boys at home, and they usually eat us out of house and home, and they definitely have appetites that are larger than an adult would be. And so when those hunger pains start, or when they're clothing, it might have been incentive for those children to say, I'm an adult and I want my full clothing and food ration. But that would also require them to join the formal workforce. It was a way that the enslaved community, and family in particular, could have shielded their children from that formal work environment and some of the hardships that would have come from it. So they would sometimes contribute a little excess clothing here or a little excess food ration there in order to keep and prolong their children in that that childhood designation away from the adult workforce as long as possible. So at this point, we're going to exit the wonderful textiles room here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the autonomy of kids. Oh, I forgot Glad Arthur. We got to take him with us.
So these rations of food and clothing you're talking about, there seems to be some small amount of choice here that an enslaved family or an enslaved teenager could perhaps say, I am ready to be an adult and join the adult workforce, but surely at some point an enslaver, an owner, is going to say, you are now an adult, you must contribute an adult's worth of work to this place, and you will be accommodated with the proper rations. But there seems to be some small
wiggle room. There's
room.
definitely wiggle room. And in the case of some children who might have been a little bit physically behind or handicapped in some way, it was a way that the family structure can protect those people from being exposed to some of the harsh elements that they would have in the fields.
And let's just remember that even though there's a little wiggle room and a semblance of choice here, when a person is enslaved, there is no such thing as choice. The condition of enslavement is absolute. So even if there is a choice about, you know, a timing for joining a workforce, that doesn't really
and I'm glad you mentioned
improve the condition of enslavement at all.
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that, Karen, because it reminds us to keep in mind that a child didn't have the choice to be a slave. That condition, that institution of slavery, oftentimes robbed children of a normal or typical childhood, but oftentimes the years that they were children were when they experienced the most autonomy, the most independence that they would in their entire lifetime. So you can see why a slave's family or the community in general would want to prolong that time of childhood as long as they possibly could. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't have responsibilities. In fact, they would have had a lot larger responsibilities than our kids would here today. They often took care of young children, from infants to toddlers. Even if you were 6, 7, 8 years old, you would have been in charge of taking care of the younger children in your household. The vast majority of the adults in the community were working elsewhere for the plantation's benefit. So the household and the area in which they were left alone was their responsibility for much part of the day. So taking care of young children, of their daily tasks, but also taking care of livestock. I'm going to cross in front of you here.
Good.
Here's Doc. Here's one of our Belgian drafts. You can get it up close.
Doc's having a snack, everybody. So just to remember, as Jean said, the condition of enslavement includes children. An enslaved child is enslaved from the moment that they are born. There is no choice. The enslaved child follows the condition of the enslaved mother. Hey everybody, if you watch Lamb Cam every afternoon at 4 p.m., here you go. Here's your bonus chickens. We even have a bonus sheep today.
For sure. This is what we were hoping for.
Hi, little guy.
Chickens, grooming horses, taking care of the old. And so we have a...
There we go. Feed's back.
Okay. We here in the household, we have a couple of implements that would have illustrated tasks that slave children would have been responsible for when the adult workforce was away from home. Greg?
One thing you will notice, guys, as you look at depictions of a lot of the enslaved communities' homes, is a swept yard. So basically what you would need is a yard rake or a broom like this, that you're going to sweep that yard every day. And what you're trying to do is actually keep any vegetation from growing in that yard. The main reason you want that, guys, is because you're doing all of your cooking and your laundry over an open fire. So when you sweep that yard free of vegetation, it becomes a natural fire break. You don't have to worry about your fire getting out of control and causing a lot of damage around the plantation. But like a lot of other things on the plantation, guys, a lot of innovations came from the enslaved community. Perfect example is a swept yard. So you're already sweeping your yard every day as a fire break. What else can you do with that? We'll take an example of a family here, guys. Hercules and Jenny lived here at Middleton Place and had Isaac and Betty as two of their children. So let's say that Hercules and Jenny get up early in the day and they're going to go out to work. Maybe Isaac and Betty are also going to spend a lot of the day away from home. Maybe they're going to be out exploring, maybe they're gathering nuts or berries. Maybe they're taking care of livestock or gardens.
We'll be touching on that in just a minute.
So if that's the case, guys, maybe one of the last things they have to do before they are able to leave the house is sweep the yard. You've now turned that into your alarm system. You've turned it into something that can tell you what's going on around your home. If you're not there during the day, you can do the same thing, sweep it before you go in to sleep at night. It will let you know if there's animals around. It'll leave tracks, snake trails. People will leave footprints. It's a good way to kind of tell what's going on at your home while you're not there. Just another of the innovations that the enslaved community comes up with on these plantations.
So housekeeping was pretty important, not only keeping a swept yard, but they had laundry to do, they had meal preparation to do before the workforce came home. So oftentimes young children would have been in collecting water, even transporting that water from a long distance. So Greg has here an apparatus from our sheds that demonstrates how a child might actually use a yoke to carry buckets of heavy water from point A to point B. Here, I'll take the board.
You got it?
Yeah. So, might save a little hand strength, but definitely not something that you would want to wear when you're taking a long walk anywhere.
That's right.
Another aspect to a child's responsibility would be collecting firewood for meal preparation. And keep in mind, you not only need water, but you need fire for most of the tasks that would have been required for feeding oneself or keeping oneself clean. So laundry required lots of boiling water, lots of hot lye soap buckets that they would use for keeping items clean. So at this point, a bit now about some of the duties that slave children would have performed for the plantation's benefit. We have talked a little bit about the benefit of the family. One thing I wanted to mention also is what Greg touched on, the fact that children were allowed to explore and go about the plantation fairly freely. So they used that time not only for leisurely pursuits, but also to benefit the family. They were providers. They brought back eggs. They checked rabbit traps. They also would have collected herbs that maybe weren't planted in a vegetable garden. This is an example of an herb garden, but outside of slaves' dwellings, there oftentimes were small vegetable gardens that would have supplemented food rations. So we've got some rosemary and mint, dill, some sage in the background, even some parsley here. Their gardens would have been incredibly important for providing for the family and supplementing that food ration. So it's not often that we think of kids as providing for the family, but they definitely did in their exploration for medicinal plants and, like we mentioned, some of the even the game. Hunting and fishing was a big part of that as well, oftentimes taking place at night when adult slaves would have returned, and maybe Hercules would have brought Isaac out fishing, and they could have provided together for their family, as well as having a little bit of enjoyment in the process.
And keep in mind too, when you're considering the ration, guys, even if it is enough food technically, it's gonna get bland after a while. You're getting a lot of potatoes and rice and corn, maybe some salted meat. Besides being healthy and by supplementing your diet, it's going to give you some different taste. It's going to get you a little bit more enjoyment out of those meals if you can serve some fish or chicken or pork or maybe some berries, nuts, things like that that you might not be given by the plantation owner.
So the concern for the family unit and the health of the family unit really did rest on some of the children's shoulders. So that's a little bit different than what we experience today. Although there were ways that maybe a slave child would have helped garden, holding a torch at night so the parents could plant some vegetables. We, as kids nowadays, might have held a flashlight for our dad to fix the car, or help put up dishes after they've been dried in the kitchen. So there are definitely correlations that you can draw in how modern kids would help to take care of their households in the same way, our chores, so to speak. So here we have some implements that would illustrate some tasks that enslaved children would do for the benefit of the plantation. So not the slave community, but more for the owners. We have here, a bucket, of course, because the first thing that we might have done is been in charge of bringing water to the workforce out in the hot fields that were in the sun. So You might have used that yoke to carry lots of buckets out into the fields, and we have a hollowed out gourd that they might have used to drink some of their water. We also would have had, the enslaved community here would have had children grinding corn. Their food ration oftentimes came in whole kernels. So in order to make corn grit or corn meal, you had to use an apparatus like this. Here, Greg will describe.
Karen, I don't know if you can see it, but you guys can see the wheel in the corner there. That's a good demonstration of what we have right here. So essentially you have the grooves cut into the wheel like that, and you have one on top of the other. Our version actually has a metal tube that's holding it together. And what we're going to do simply is spin the top stone and grind that corn up between both wheels.
Notice I have Greg doing all the hard stuff.
Let's see.
Yeah, counterclockwise.
Oh, there we go.
So because of the direction of those grooves, you have to actually run the wheels counterclockwise in order for them to catch in the grooves and start grinding the corn.
And guys, one thing you'll notice right away is it is not the most efficient machine on the plantation. A lot of those kernels are making it through without being ground all the way down. So you would have to constantly sweep this back up, put it back in, and keep on grinding until you get to about this level. So a lot more like a flour.
Another way that children were utilized in the plantation system would have been processing rice.
Now guys, we're not going to get too into detail about it today because you guys can tune back in next week and we're going to have all kinds of programming about processing rice itself. These are two of the tools you're going to learn about next week when you tune in. So this is a mortar, is essentially a hollowed out tree trunk. It could be vertical like this, it could also be flat on the ground. And then you have the pestle. So you have the, it's essentially a club. You have two different shapes though, guys. Keep in mind you have a flat end and you have a pointed end. You'll learn why next week. But that's actually a job that a lot of the enslaved children would do as well, is pound the rice and help process the rice.
And although that wasn't considered a skilled task, like a carpenter or a mason, this definitely takes a lot of skill. They produce grit, rice grit, or what we call middlings, and that would have been something that slave children could have taken home to also help provide for the family.
That essentially means, guys, that the grain itself has been broken, and so the plantation owner is not going to sell that, so then it will be used as part of the ration here on a plantation.
So to protect that grain of rice, to make sure you have an intact grain of rice to ship, they utilized children in the fields, sometimes posed, especially at two very important times of the growing season when our migratory birds were heading north during the planting, and also when they started returning south during harvest.
You might want to turn down the microphone for this one. This is a rice rattle. So it's not necessarily this, it could just be banging pots and pans. Anything that makes noise or movement that'll scare those birds away. I'll demonstrate this real quick. So that gives you an idea of just how loud it is.
I think I used one of those in plastic at New Year's.
Yeah. Well, we've even learned this lesson the hard way in the modern day when we grow our demonstration rice field. Those rice birds can wipe out an entire crop. So that would have definitely been one of the jobs for young children enslaved on the plantation.
One of our interactive exhibits a couple of years ago was that we left some noise-making devices out by the rice field, didn't we? And we invited our visitors to help us clear the rice birds out. So perhaps in the days post-COVID-19, when you are all able to come back and visit us again and we are able to have proper sanitizing measures in place, we can do that again and you can help us keep the rice birds. Rice birds are forever. They've been here for hundreds of years.
So from here, we're going to migrate over to one of our formal shops. Young children, as early as 7, can be apprenticed. So as opposed to the formal education that the Middletons might have received, the Middletons' children might have received, this was probably as close to a formal education that a young slave might receive when they're learning a specific skill like carpentry, masonry, coopering, blacksmithing. So if you'll follow me over to the carpenter shop, I'll show you one task that an apprentice, even a young apprentice, could have done for a carpenter. And you're probably, the light and dark is probably wreaking havoc on you all.
You're all good. You like them.
So this is the great wheel. A carpenter would have used the great wheel to enact the lathe. The lathe is the part where you can affix a stationary piece of wood at first and center it, and then you can tool out a table leg in pretty great detail.
So this dowel that this piece of wood is on turns when the great wheel turns.
Yes, and so if you turn and to look at me, you can see how this starts the process. And so a carpenter would actually use a sharp object to tool out their leg, while an apprentice could be standing here, turning the great lathe. Definitely a two-man job.
And so a child as young as 7 or 8 is doing that all day long while the carpenter works on the lathe.
Even if they weren't working on the lathe all day long, an apprentice would be certainly privy to all the workings of the shop, probably doing most of the grunt work.
One of the things that we've talked about in blacksmith shops before is that it's probably the youngest apprentices who are arriving early. They're the ones starting the fires, and they're the ones pulling on the bellows all day long to keep that fire hot and going. So,
right.
As you mentioned, this is, what would pass as a formal education for an enslaved child. And this is
Starting fairly young.
Yeah, and this is generally something that if an enslaved child is apprenticed, they're being apprenticed to a master, so that master is being paid to educate that enslaved child.
Not only was the master perhaps being paid to educate the child in that way, but this was an opportunity for the slave to also generate wealth for themselves, not only for the master. When that slave was rented out or bartered out to neighboring plantations, the master would get a portion of the earnings that that skilled worker would have earned.
So this is a way that plantation owners, enslavers, are making an additional investment into people, because remember, everybody, enslaved workers are not being understood as people in these days. They're being understood as an economic investment. And so the owner of the plantation is considering a worthwhile investment to pay to educate an enslaved person as an artisan to increase a return on that investment. So we do have a couple of questions. Do we know, sorry, you have an addition to that.
Oh, I was just going to mention even cooking. Skilled cooks and pastry chefs were utilized in the main house, and they were sent sometimes to Europe for some formal training. Of course, the Middletons wanted to serve European fare to their European counterparts when they came to visit. So that was a way that they actually received some very formal training, and at Middleton's expense.
And to that point, musicians as well. Mm-hmm. We're talking about formal parties, parties that the Middletons are throwing, then the classical musicians are not the Middletons themselves. The Middletons pursue these activities to be well-rounded individuals, but enslaved workers pursue these activities of classical music in order to, again, perform different kinds of tasks. So if you are interested in the history of that, by the way, our wonderful descendant and board member Lee Pringle has the Color of Music Festival that he has been putting on for several years here in Charleston, and he really focuses on the history of classical music in the African American community. So y'all should go Google Color of Music. So I have a couple of questions here. Let me scroll back. Do we know how many hours a day a child would be required to work?
It's probably not a set amount. Like we mentioned yesterday and today, a lot of what you're doing is helping your family and your community throughout the day. So you're it's really almost like a micro version of the task system that a lot of the adults are operating under. So you're going to have a certain amount of things that you really need to get done during the day, but you would figure that for most of the enslaved children, they are not going to be doing what we would consider work the entire time from sunup to sundown. Probably a shorter day than a lot of the adults working on the plantation.
Some of the formal tasks that we mentioned in the outdoor shed there with bringing water to the fields or grinding corn, that would have been considered probably a quarter task of an adult. And so that was a way that they could maybe regulate their time a little bit.
So then I have two questions that are kind of similar. How would an apprentice have been chosen, or how were enslaved children chosen to learn certain skills?
Well, that thing from maybe a child shows some aptitude towards something, or maybe one of their parents is the person on the plantation performing that skill. So they've already been around it for a lot of their childhood. Maybe they're starting to pick up little hints and ways to do things even before they are formally introduced into apprenticeship. So that could be one of the factors.
That's another way we can liken it to the modern era, where if you had a family business, oftentimes you would be involved in that family business from a very early age. So you not only used some of the skills that your parents would be displaying in their work, but you learned kind of the inner workings of the business.
So one more quick request. So if we can distill this down, if we wanted to talk about relating to a first grader's life today, especially today during coronavirus, right? So we've got first graders all over the country who are being homeschooled possibly for the first time, and they have school responsibilities they have to do. They might have chores at home, but they also want to make sure they get some leisure time and go outside. So can we just, in a few quick sentences, sort of relate this for a first grader? What does life look like in the 18th century that's different and that's very similar to their lives right now?
Well, like we mentioned, for a 5 or 6 year old, you might be in charge without the overseeing of your parents of taking care of some of the household duties, even taking care of your younger siblings. That could be toddlers or even an infant. That kind of blows our mind nowadays. But as a 6 or 7 year old, you'd have the capability of lifting a child, diapering a child, feeding, and making sure that child was looked after all day. So that responsibility would be a little different than what we have today. But on the side of the formal education, it's expected that our first graders go off to school. We start learning to read and write, and so that's something that the Middleton's children would have experienced even as an early age with a governess.
I would say comparing it to today's children at 6 or 7, first grade or second grade age, would have probably had more responsibilities to take care of themselves during the day.
Independently.
That's right, than a lot of first graders would today. First graders today have the benefit of having an adult around to kind of oversee and kind of tell them how to do things. Whereas back then, a lot of times enslaved children would be on their own. Once they were shown how to do it, it is their responsibility to take care of it every day without any kind of supervision.
So expectations would have been pretty different.
So guys, if you're thinking about, if you're watching us right now and you're 6 or 7 or 8 years old and you feel like every second of your life is scheduled for you, is structured, you're not alone. The Middleton children of various generations would have experienced that as well. And if you feel like you are finding that you have a lot of time that you have to entertain yourselves because mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or aunt or uncle have their own responsibilities to take care of and they can't entertain you, right, then there's a lot of parallels historically for that too. Kids had to entertain themselves. And by entertain, I don't just mean entertain, I mean educate too.
And contribute to your family's well-being in your household. So chores might seem kind of dull, but they do fill up those long hours of your days now that we're kind of stuck at home. Yeah. I was going to say in conclusion, it might be a good thing to think about some of the ways that you, if you're a child watching this from home, how you contribute to your family's well-being, how you might compare yourself to the Middleton's formal education. And if you'd like to tune back in on Friday and join our live discussion with other kids, that would be a great way to kind of give us some of your input.
Yeah, thank you. So, folks, this has been On the Farm Wednesday. We want you to drop your other questions or comments if you have them. Go ahead and do that now. If you do that after the broadcast is over, that's no big deal. We'll be happy to answer them in the comments section. But we want you to keep your eye on our social media today. One of our Middleton staff family has provided us with a really excellent performance that we are going to post on Instagram and on Facebook later today. So shout out to Brianna, who is a student of music, much like many Middleton and enslaved children. She discovered a piece of violin music and has recorded and performed it for us. So I can't insert it into this live broadcast, but I'm absolutely going to be featuring it as a separate piece here shortly. So please keep your eye on Instagram and right here on Facebook to experience a little bit of 18th century music courtesy of April's daughter Brianna. So thank you so much, Bree. We really appreciate that. And Bree will be joining us on Friday, so we'll get to talk to her about it a little bit. So, all right. I don't really see any other questions, folks. So from the education team here, this is Jean and Greg, the Department of Education at Middleton Place Foundation. And Flat Arthur. Thank you. So, thank you all very much. This has been On the Farm Wednesday, plugged into history, talking about kids' work and responsibilities today. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate y'all. Thanks for engaging, and thanks, as always, for sharing and commenting. We can't do what we do without you. So we appreciate you contributing to our mission, and if you are so inclined, if you're able now or in the future, to help maintain these beautiful shops, these wonderful artisan spaces, and these great animals that we've shared with you today, feel free to go to middletonplace.org/donate. Did y'all know that we have a matching grant in place right now? We do, yeah. That matching grant is still in play right now, so every dollar you give is doubled. So thank you very much, everybody, and we can't wait to see you tomorrow. Hey, Greg, what's coming up tomorrow?
We're making some marbles tomorrow, guys, so tune back in.
All right, Hands on History.
Getting dirty.
Yeah, Hands on History tomorrow at 11. Same Middleton Place time, same Middleton Place channel. All right, keep an eye out for Bree's Violin. We'll see y'all later.
Thanks, bye guys.